The mansion was quiet, too quiet for a house with children. Then it happened. A sound so light it almost slipped past belief. Laughter. Edward Harrington stopped mid-step, his fingers tightening around the folder in his hand as a second sound followed. Soft, broken, unmistakable. "Ma, ma." He didn't breathe. The word wasn't supposed to exist. His daughters had never seen a face, never formed a word, and every doctor he trusted had sworn they never would. The folder slipped from his grip and landed against the marble floor as Edward turned toward the nursery door, already open just enough to reveal what shouldn't have been possible. The maid was on the floor. Ruth Hoffman, still in her uniform, wearing yellow, clean hand gloves, knelt with her arms extended. Sophia and Amelia stood in front of her, unsteady but smiling, their tiny hands reaching until they found her palms. They weren't crying. They weren't confused. They were laughing. And then it happened again. One of them shaping the sound with her mouth, the other answering, both of them facing Ruth as if she were the only person in the room. Edward's chest locked. He had paid for the best specialists in the country. He had memorized diagnoses, schedules, probabilities, congenital blindness, nonverbal prognosis, permanent, final. He had buried his wife and built a world of control so nothing like this could hurt him again. And now the impossible was unfolding 10 feet away. Ruth didn't see him. Her voice stayed calm, warm, careful, as though the moment might shatter if she raised it. Edward stepped back before the floor could betray him, easing the door, closed until the sound softened but didn't disappear. The laughter followed him down the hall, echoing where silence had lived for years. Alone in his study, Edward stood at the window and stared at a garden no one used. The swings were still, the toys untouched. The house he had built to survive grief suddenly felt like it was holding its breath. One question circled his mind, relentless and sharp. What was she doing that no doctor ever could? And why was it working now? Let's go back to where it all started. But before we begin, click subscribe, like this video, and tell me where in the world you're watching from. I hope this story makes you believe that nothing is impossible if only you believe. Now let's get back to the story. Edward did not return to the nursery that night. He remained in his study long after the laughter faded, standing at the window as dusk pressed against the glass. The garden below lay untouched, perfectly trimmed and utterly lifeless. White stone paths, sculpted hedges, swings that had never known momentum. Everything was orderly. Everything was quiet, the way he had designed it. Silence had become his definition of safety. It hadn't always been that way. The memory came without warning, sharp and invasive, as memories like to do when control loosens its grip. The hospital room had smelled like antiseptic and rain. Machines hummed in precise rhythms, numbers blinking with indifferent accuracy. Edward remembered holding Margaret's hand, how warm it was, how she squeezed his fingers and smiled despite the pain. She had been exhausted, radiant, afraid, and brave all at once. "You'll love them," she had whispered, breath shallow but determined. No matter what. He had nodded, unable to speak, convinced that love alone would be enough. Then the room had changed. Voices sharpened. Movements accelerated. A doctor said his name too loudly. Someone asked him to step back. Another hand replaces on hers, firm and professional. Margaret's eyes met his one last time, steady, apologetic, full of things she would never get to say. And then she was gone. 2 babies cried somewhere beyond a curtain. Edward heard them, but the sound felt distant, as if it belonged to another man's life. Grief arrived quietly at first. It sat beside him, heavy but manageable, whispering that time would soften the edges. He believed it, until the doctors came. They didn't waste words. Congenital blindness, severe neural impairment, nonverbal prognosis, unlikely to develop speech, physical limitations unknown, therapy options limited, prepare for permanent care. They spoke as if reciting inventory, as if Sophia and Amelia were outcomes instead of infants, as if the future had already been decided. Edward asked questions, more questions than they expected. He took notes. He requested specialists. Flew in experts from 3 countries. bought opinions until the answers stopped changing. Love still lived in him then, but it was panicked, unanchored. It didn't know where to go. So it transformed. Love became control. Grief became schedules. The mansion changed first. Walls repainted in white and pale gray, colors that didn't shout, didn't surprise. Furniture chosen for symmetry, for softness, for predictability. Corners rounded. Sounds muted. Hallways widened so no one would ever bump into anything unseen. Rooms echoed, but Edward told himself it was good. Echoes meant space. Space meant safety. Sophia and Amelia grew within that order, their lives carefully managed like delicate experiments. Every hour mapped, every interaction supervised. Therapists rotated in and out. Specialists spoke in hushed tones. Progress was measured in millimeters and seconds. Edward watched from a distance. He told himself it was necessary. Physical closeness felt dangerous. What if he startled them? What if his grief spilled over and frightened them? What if they sensed the fracture in him, the place where Margaret should have been? So he stood back. He issued instructions instead of hugs, approved routines instead of bedtime stories. He learned to love them through glass walls and observation windows, through reports and recordings and carefully worded updates. Sophia liked music, they said. Amelia responded to vibration. Edward bought instruments, installed sound systems calibrated to exact frequencies, played recordings at approved volumes. He never sang. The garden remained unused. At first, he had planned to fill it with life, grass soft enough for bare feet, flowers chosen for scent rather than color, wind chimes tuned to gentle notes. But plans stalled. Toys arrived and were boxed, stacked neatly in storage rooms that smelled of cardboard and regret. Children needed protection from the world, Edward reasoned, and protection required control. Silence, especially, felt essential. Silence meant no sudden noises, no confusion, no fear. Silence meant nothing could hurt them the way life had hurt him. He mistook that silence for peace. Years passed like this, ordered, restrained, emotionally distant. The house functioned perfectly. Staff moved quietly. Doctors approved. Progress remained minimal, but stable. Edward told himself stability was success. And then Ruth Hoffman arrived. She was unremarkable on paper. Middle-aged, no advanced degrees. Referred by an agency that specialized in long-term domestic staff. She spoke plainly, moved calmly, listened more than she talked. Edward approved her hire without much thought. She cleaned thoroughly. She followed instructions. She respected routines. At first. Then small deviations crept in. Edward noticed them only in hindsight. Ruth hummed while she worked. Not loudly, just enough to be felt. She spoke to the girls even when no one else did, narrating her actions as if sound itself were a bridge. She sat on the floor instead of standing over them. Let her hands be found instead of guiding theirs. Edward should have stopped it. It wasn't on the schedule. It wasn't approved. But nothing bad happened. The girls didn't cry. They didn't regress. If anything, they seemed lighter. Still, Edward kept his distance. He told himself observation was enough. Until tonight. Until laughter broke the rules he had lived by. Standing alone in his study, Edward finally understood the truth he had avoided for years. The order he built was not love. It was fear wearing discipline like armor. And somewhere down the hall, beyond the white walls and managed silence, something uncontrollable had begun. Not chaos. Connection. Edward closed his eyes for the first time in years and let the sound replay in his mind. Not as a threat, but as a question. If silence was protection, what had sound been all along? And what would it cost him to let stay? Ruth Hoffman arrived without announcement. No dramatic entrance. No long introductions. She stepped into the mansion with a single suitcase, shoes wiped carefully at the door, posture relaxed but alert. She listened more than she spoke, her eyes scanning not the decor, but the spaces between things, the distance from wall to wall, the way sound lingered, the pauses in conversation. Edward barely noticed her at first. That, it seemed, was exactly how she preferred it. On her first day, Ruth did not ask many questions. She observed. She moved slowly through the house, absorbing its rhythms. She noted how footsteps echoed down the corridors, how even the softest sound traveled too far, too cleanly. The mansion didn't just hold silence, it amplified it. In the nursery, she stopped just inside the doorway. Sophia and Amelia sat side by side on a padded mat, small bodies still, faces turned slightly upward as if listening for something that never arrived. A nurse stood nearby, clipboard in hand, monitoring rather than engaging. Ruth didn't step forward right away. She watched. When a nurse shifted her weight, Ruth saw it, the subtle tightening in Amelia's shoulders. When the door closed softly behind them, Sophia flinched, fingers curling inward. They weren't startled by noise exactly. They were startled by its unpredictability. Ruth understood something then that no report could capture. The girls listened with their bodies. She approached quietly, not to avoid sound, but to let it announce itself. Her footsteps were steady, rhythmic, intentional. She crouched down to their level, not looming, not hovering. "Good morning," she said, not softly, not loudly. Just human. The nurse glanced at her, surprised. Talking wasn't discouraged, but it wasn't encouraged either. There was no point, the specialist said. The girls couldn't respond. Ruth smiled anyway. She reached out slowly, letting her hand brush against Sophia's fingers. Not guiding, not testing, just present. Sophia didn't pull away. Ruth let her stay there a moment, then spoke again. "I'm sitting down now." She sat. "I'm folding the blanket." She folded it deliberately, the fabric brushing against the girls' legs so they could feel the movement. Her voice stayed calm, consistent, warm. Amelia tilted her head. It was small, barely noticeable, but Ruth noticed. Over the next few days, patterns emerged. Ruth learned how the twins responded to vibration more than sound, to tone more than words. She learned that they calmed with touch, not sudden or corrective, but steady and reassuring. That they understood smiles not by seeing them, but by feeling the way a face softened, the way breath changed. She narrated everything. "I'm washing my hands. I'm picking up the cup. I'm right here." When Sophia reached for something and missed, Ruth didn't correct her. She guided her hands until they found what they were looking for, letting the success belong to the child, not the adult. When Amelia grew restless, Ruth didn't restrain her. She placed a hand over Amelia's chest, matching her breathing until the tension eased. It wasn't therapy. It was presence. The nurses began to notice. At first, they dismissed it as coincidence, then as novelty. But the changes were consistent. The girls cried less, slept more soundly. Their bodies relaxed in ways they hadn't before. They turned toward Ruth's voice, not because they could see her, but because they trusted where she was. One nurse mentioned it to Edward in passing. "They seem calmer lately," she said carefully. "More responsive." Edward didn't look up from his tablet. "Routine compliance tends to improve over time," he replied. "Document it." Another nurse tried again days later. "They seem to anticipate her," she said. Edward interrupted. "Correlation isn't causation." He believed that fully. Ruth continued anyway. She didn't push boundaries. She didn't argue. She didn't ask permission for kindness. She simply stayed consistent. Edward observed from afar, as he always did, through doorways, from the end of halls. He noticed the differences, but attributed them to variables he could control: adjusted schedules, improved care, better staff coordination. What he didn't account for was Ruth's refusal to treat silence as sacred. Then one afternoon, it happened again. Edward was crossing the East Wing, already thinking ahead to meetings and reports, when the sound reached him. Unexpected, unmistakable. Laughter, not the sharp cry of distress, not the random noise of discomfort. Laughter. He stopped. It came from a nursery. Edward stood frozen, heart pounding, the sound echoing against everything he had built. He didn't move closer. He didn't move away. He just listened because this time, the silence had been broken on purpose, and he wasn't sure whether to stop it or step inside. Edward waited until the house settled into its afternoon stillness. He chose his moment carefully, when the nurses were gone, when Sophia and Amelia were resting, when the mansion felt once again like something he could manage. Ruth was in the hallway, folding linen with unhurried precision when he spoke. "Miss Hoffman." She turned immediately. No flinch. No defensiveness. Just attention. "Yes, sir." He gestured toward the sitting room. Neutral ground. Controlled space. They sat across from one another, a wide table between them, polished to a sterile shine. Edward folded his hands, fingers tight. "I've noticed changes," he began. His voice was measured, professional. "The staff has mentioned increased reactions. Sounds. Movements." Ruth nodded once. She did not smile. "I need to be very clear," Edward continued. "The doctors have been clear. The prognosis is clear. These children cannot see. They cannot speak. Any appearance of progress can be confusing," Ruth finished gently. Edward paused. He hadn't expected that. "Yes," he said after a beat. "Confusing. And dangerous. False hope is. I know what false hope looks like, sir." Her tone never rose. It didn't need to. Edward leaned back, unsettled despite himself. "Then you understand why I can't allow improvisation." Ruth met his gaze steadily. "I'm not teaching them," she said. "I'm meeting them." The words landed softly and stayed. Edward frowned. "Meeting them how?" "Where they are," Ruth replied. "Not where we wish they were. Not where a chart says they should be." Silence stretched between them. Edward felt the familiar tightening in his chest, the reflex to regain control. "The specialists," he said, "have dedicated their lives to understanding these conditions. I trust them, as you should," Ruth said. "They know the body. And you, I know presence." He stood abruptly. "This ends here," he said. "I don't want expectations raised. I don't want attachment mistaken for progress." Ruth stood as well, smoothing her apron. "Of course, sir. No argument. No plea." That was what bothered him most. For days after, Edward told himself the conversation had settled things. He increased check-ins, requested more detailed reports, watched Ruth closely without speaking to her directly. And Ruth continued. Quietly. She didn't escalate. She didn't announce changes. She didn't claim credit. She kept narrating her movements, kept guiding small hands instead of correcting them, kept creating rhythms, soft taps on the floor, gentle claps, hums with patterns the girls could feel through the air, and the twins began to answer. It was subtle at first. Sophia turned her head when Ruth entered the room, not sharply, not every time, but enough to be noticed. Amelia's fingers curled around Ruth's hand and stayed there longer than reflex allowed. Once, Ruth tapped a slow pattern against the mat. Tap, tap, pause. Sophia echoed it. Just once. Just barely. Ruth froze, breath held. She didn't celebrate. She didn't repeat it immediately. She let the moment exist, unclaimed. Edward saw none of this. Not officially. But late at night, when the house was quiet and the lights were low, he found himself lingering near the nursery door, standing just out of sight, listening. He told himself it was oversight. Due diligence. From the hallway, he heard Ruth's voice, steady, warm, patient. I'm right here. That's it. I felt that too. He heard the girls respond, not with words but with sound. Soft hums, small breaths that changed pitch. A rhythm forming where there had once been only noise. Edward clenched his jaw. This wasn't progress. It couldn't be. And yet, one evening, as rain tapped against the tall windows, Edward watched from the shadowed doorway as Ruth sat cross-legged on the floor. Sophia and Amelia were between her knees, backs resting against her thighs. Ruth placed their hands together and began tapping a gentle beat against their knuckles. Top, top, pause. Amelia mimicked it. Edward's heart skipped. Ruth didn't look up. She didn't react. She simply continued the rhythm, as if this were the most natural thing in the world. Edward stepped back silently, pulse racing. Control had always been his refuge. Structure, authority, expertise. But something was happening beyond his reach. Trust was taking root where certainty had failed. And for the first time since the twins were born, Edward felt afraid. Not of loss, but of what it might mean to let go. The sound reached Edward before he understood what it was. It was late, well past midnight, when a mansion slipped into its deepest quiet, the kind of quiet he had cultivated on purpose. No footsteps, no machines, No voices drifting down corridors. Just order. Just control. Then the melody surfaced. Soft. Careful. Almost afraid to exist. Edward froze at the top of the stairs, one hand gripping the banister. His breath caught before his mind could intervene, before logic could dismantle the reaction. He knew that tune. He hadn't heard it in 4 years. Not since the hospital room. Not since the smell of antiseptic and blood. Not since the flatline tone that had erased his wife from the world and left him holding 2 children who could not see him and would never speak his name. The melody drifted again, 3 notes rising, 1 falling. A lullaby unfinished, looping back on itself. Edward's chest tightened painfully. No one else knew that song. Slowly, silently, he moved down the hall toward the nursery. The door was slightly ajar, warm light spilling into the corridor. He stopped just outside, afraid that if he stepped closer, the sound would vanish. Ruth sat on the floor, her back to the door. Sophia and Amelia lay on either side of her, small bodies relaxed, their breathing deep and even. Ruth hummed as she gently traced slow circles on their arms, her voice barely more than breath. Edward felt something inside him rupture. He stepped into the room. The floor creaked. Ruth stopped mid-note, startled. She turned, eyes widening when she saw him. Sir, I'm sorry, she said quickly, standing. I didn't mean to wake them. Edward raised a hand, though he wasn't sure what he was asking her to stop. Where did you learn that song? He asked. His voice sounded wrong to his own ears. Raw, unsteady. Ruth hesitated. Then she reached toward the shelf beneath the window and pulled out a small, worn notebook. I found it, she said softly. Under the bed, tucked behind a box. Edward stared at the notebook like it might burn him. I didn't read everything, Ruth continued. Just enough to know it mattered. She opened it carefully and held it out to him. Edward didn't take it at first. He saw her handwriting before he touched the page. His wife's hand had always leaned slightly to the right. The ink pressed harder at the end of words, as if she wrote with conviction, even when unsure. For when I'm not there, the words blurred instantly. Edward turned away without thinking, retreating toward the window. He pressed his palm against the glass, grounding himself in the cold. His shoulders shook once, then again. For years of restraint collapsed in on itself. He didn't sob. He broke, quietly, completely. The kind of breaking that happens when grief has been sealed too long and finally finds a crack. Behind him, Ruth said nothing. She didn't approach. She didn't speak. She understood that this moment belonged to the past and the man standing inside it. When Edward finally turned back, his face was wet, his composure gone. She wrote that when she was pregnant, he said hoarsely, she was afraid she wouldn't be here long enough to teach them. Ruth nodded. She loved them fiercely. Edward laughed once, bitter and hollow. Both girls jolted, hands flailing blindly, their bodies betraying them in the only way they could. Fear surged through them without context, without language, without sight. The nurses rushed in, instinctive and trained, but they hesitated at the doorway. Storms always did this. Machines could be unplugged, curtains drawn, routines followed. But panic, real panic, didn't respond to protocols. Sophia's breathing grew shallow. Amelia rocked back and forth, her hands clawing at the mattress as if the world itself had tilted. Edward stood frozen just outside the room. His first instinct was retreat. Storms had always been delegated, managed, something other people handled while he maintained distance, order, control. Another thunderclap roared overhead, closer still. Sophia's body jerked violently. Sir, one of the nurses said, uncertain. We can administer. No, Ruth said sharply. Edward turned. Ruth had entered without sound, already kneeling beside the cribs. She placed one steady hand on each child, grounding them, her voice cutting through the chaos with calm authority. They don't need medicine, she said. They need anchoring. Another boom shook the house. Amelia let out a strangled sound, terror flooding her small frame. Ruth looked up at Edward. Hold them. The word struck him harder than the thunder. Edward stared at her. I what? Now, Ruth said, firm but gentle. They don't know what's happening. They just know the world feels dangerous. You're their constant. You have to be the ground. Edward shook his head instinctively. I don't want to hurt them. Ruth stood, stepping directly in front of him. You won't, she said. You've been hurting them by staying away. The storm roared again, almost on top of them now. Sophia's breathing bordered on hyperventilation. Edward's heart pounded so loudly he could barely hear himself think. He had avoided this moment for 4 years. Avoided the weight of them, the fragility, the unbearable fear of breaking something already broken. But there was no room left to hide. Edward, Ruth said, softer now. They don't need perfect. They need present. Something inside him finally gave way. He stepped forward. The nurses moved aside as he approached the cribs, his hands trembling as he reached for Sophia first. She startled at the contact, stiffening instantly, but he didn't pull away. He lifted her carefully, awkwardly, as though holding something made of glass. Her body shook violently against his chest. Edward froze, panic spiking. She's not calming. Keep holding, Ruth instructed. Breathe slower. Let her feel your heartbeat. Edward swallowed hard and forced his breathing to slow. In his arms, Sophia's head pressed against his chest, right over his heart. She stilled. Not completely, but enough. Edward felt it. The shift. He reached for Amelia next, pulling her close with one arm, sandwiching both girls against him, unsure, terrified, overwhelmed. The thunder boomed again. This time, neither girl screamed. They clutched at his shirt, small fingers gripping fabric, grounding themselves in him. Edward's breath hitched painfully. They were clinging to him. Not the nurse. Not the routine. Not the silence. Him. Ruth knelt beside them, one hand resting lightly on Edward's arm, her voice calm and steady amid the chaos. That's it, she said. They're listening with their bodies. You're telling them they're safe. Edward closed his eyes. Sophia's breathing slowed first. Amelia followed, her body relaxing inch by inch, until the frantic tension drained from her limbs. The storm continued to rage outside, but inside the nursery, something had shifted permanently. Edward felt tears spill freely down his face. He hadn't held them like this before. Not really. Not without fear. Not without distance. Now with their full weight against him. He felt the truth he had avoided for years crash into him with the force of the storm itself. They weren't fragile objects to be preserved. They were children, and they were his. Ruth spoke quietly, her words meant only for him. It's not words yet, she said. It's trust. That's where speaking begins. Edward nodded, unable to speak. The storm began to recede slowly, thunder rolling farther away, rain easing into a steady rhythm. Sophia sighed softly in her sleep. Amelia's grip loosened, her head settling against Edward's shoulder. He didn't move, didn't dare. He stayed there long after the storm passed, holding them as if letting go might undo everything. And in that stillness, Edward stepped fully, finally, into fatherhood. Not as a protector of silence, but as a shelter, as presence, as love. The house no longer felt like it was holding its breath. Not the way it used to. There was still quiet, soft, intentional, but it was no longer empty. It carried weight now, meaning, expectation. Edward stood just outside the nursery door, unwilling to cross the threshold too quickly, as if the moment might shatter if rushed. Inside, Ruth sat on the floor between the girls, her back straight, her movements slow and deliberate. No machines, no charts, no instructions taped to the wall, just her hands. Sophia lay to Ruth's left, Amelia to her right. Their small palms rested open in Ruth's lap, relaxed, trusting. Ruth took Sophia's hand first, her finger warm and steady as she traced a simple pattern across the center of her palm. One slow line, a pause, 2 gentle taps. She repeated it. Again, Amelia stirred, her head tilted slightly, as if listening, not with ears but with attention. Ruth moved to Amelia's palm and traced the same pattern. Identical rhythm, identical pressure. Nothing rushed. Edward's chest tightened. He had seen therapists attempt progress with urgency, frustration, force. Ruth carried none of that. What she carried was patience sharpened into purpose. Sophia's fingers twitched. Then, hesitant, uncertain, she moved. Her small hand lifted from Ruth's lap, hovering in the air as if searching for the memory of sensation. Slowly, awkwardly, she brought her fingers back down and dragged them across Ruth's palm. Not clean, not precise, but intentional. Edward sucked in a breath. Ruth froze. She didn't speak, didn't praise, didn't interrupt the fragile thread forming between them. She simply waited. Sophia repeated the motion. One line, a pause, 2 taps. Amelia let out a soft sound, something between a hum and a breath. And then she moved too. Her fingers brushed Ruth's palm, clumsy but unmistakable. The same pattern. Ruth's breath trembled. Her eyes filled, but she did not look away from the girls. You're remembering, she whispered. You're choosing. Edward stepped forward without realizing it. The floor creaked softly beneath his weight. Both girls stiffened, not in fear, but awareness. Edward stopped, heart pounding, unsure whether to speak. Ruth looked up at him. Just once. She nodded. Edward swallowed hard and lowered himself to the floor across from them. He kept his voice low, steady, stripped of command and expectation. Sophia, he said softly. A pause. Amelia. The sound of his voice filled the space between them. Both girls turned their heads. Not sharply, not suddenly, but unmistakably toward him. Edward's breath shattered. They weren't seeing him. They were finding him. He spoke again, his voice breaking through years of restraint. It's Daddy. Sophia leaned forward slightly, her hands lifting, reaching toward the sound. Amelia followed, mirroring her sister, their movements syncing without instruction. Edward didn't wait. He leaned in, closing the distance, letting their hands rest against his chest, his arms, his face. He let them explore him the way Ruth had taught, slowly, safely. Sophia's fingers brushed his cheek. Amelia's hand found his jaw. Edward closed his eyes. For the first time, the silence broke, not with words, but with recognition. They didn't need sight to know him. They didn't need speech to answer him. They were connected. Tears streamed freely down Edward's face, unashamed, unstoppable. Love had never been impossible. He had simply been absent. And now, kneeling on the nursery floor, surrounded by the soft rhythm of breath and touch, Edward understood the truth too late and yet just in time. Silence had never protected them. Presence would, and the moment held, fragile and eternal, as if daring the world to interrupt it. The offer arrived quietly, not with celebration or cameras or applause, but with a phone call that came early in the morning, when the house was still wrapped in its new, gentle hush. Ruth stood in the corridor outside the nursery, phone pressed to her ear, eyes fixed on the window at the far end of the hall. Morning light spilled across the white floor, softer now than it used to be. Warmer. Yes, she said calmly. I understand. Edward had paused halfway down the stairs when he heard her voice. He hadn't meant to listen. He told himself that as he stopped, one hand resting on the railing, his body instinctively still. He recognized the tone, measured, respectful, guarded. The tone people used when opportunity knocked loudly enough to be dangerous. We're honored, the voice on the other end said faintly, leaking through the quiet. Your work has been remarkable. What you've done with the girls, it challenges everything we thought we knew. Edward's heart tightened. Ruth didn't smile, didn't straighten with pride. I didn't do anything remarkable, she replied. I stayed. There was a pause. Edward took one step lower, careful not to let the stair creak. The Institute would like to offer you a position, the voice continued. A full appointment, research funding, a platform. You could teach this method, your approach, to professionals all over the world. Ruth closed her eyes. Edward's breath caught. He imagined it instantly. Ruth in conference halls under lights, her name on papers and panels. The world recognizing what he had almost dismissed. Silence stretched. Then Ruth spoke. Thank you, she said softly. But I can't accept. Edward's hand tightened around the railing. May I ask why? The voice pressed, disbelief edging in. Ruth looked toward the nursery door. Inside, Sophia, and Amelia were awake. Edward could hear the faint sounds, the soft hum of breath, the quiet shifting of blankets. They already have what they need, Ruth said. Consistency. Love. Someone who won't leave. Another pause. This could change lives, the voice insisted. Ruth's reply was steady. It already has. The call ended. Ruth lowered the phone slowly, as if setting down something heavy but necessary. She stood there for a long moment, breathing, grounding herself, unaware that Edward was watching from the stairs, his chest tight with something that felt dangerously like awe. He stepped forward then, deliberately. She turned, startled. "Oh, sir, I didn't realize." "I heard," Edward said quietly. Ruth's shoulders squared, not defensively but honestly. "I hope that wasn't inappropriate." Edward shook his head once. "No." They stood facing each other in the corridor that once felt like a hospital wing and now felt like a home learning how to breathe again. "You turned it down," Edward said. "Yes." "Why?" Ruth didn't answer immediately. She glanced again toward the nursery. "Because this isn't work to me," she said, "and they aren't a case study." Edward swallowed. "I spent my life believing ambition was proof of value," he said slowly. "That recognition meant you mattered." Ruth met his eyes. "Sometimes staying is the bravest thing you can do." Something in Edward broke open then, not loudly, not dramatically, but cleanly. He gestured toward the sitting room. "Will you sit with me?" Ruth hesitated only a second before nodding. They sat across from each other, no desk between them, no contract waiting to be signed. Just two people in a house that had already changed more than either of them expected. "I want to ask you something," Edward said. His voice was steady, but the weight behind it was unmistakable. Ruth waited. "I don't want you here as staff anymore." Her breath caught, but she didn't speak. "I don't want hierarchy in this house," Edward continued. "I don't want titles that separate the people my daughters trust from the people who love them." He paused. "I want you to stay," he said. "As family." The word landed between them. Simple, heavy, final. Ruth's eyes filled instantly. She looked down at her hands, fingers trembling despite her effort to keep them still. That's not something I expected," she said softly. "I know," Edward replied, "and I won't pretend it's a small thing. But I also won't pretend this house would survive without you." Silence wrapped around them, not empty, not cold. Alive. Ruth lifted her gaze. "I don't need recognition," she said. "I never did." Edward nodded. "Neither do they." Another beat passed. Then Ruth smiled. Not wide, not triumphant, but warm. "Certain. I'll stay," she said, "as long as they always come first." Edward didn't hesitate. "They always will." In the nursery, Sophia laughed suddenly, light, unguarded. Amelia followed a second later, her laughter softer but just as sure. Edward and Ruth both turned toward the sound. For the first time, there was no line between who belonged and who served. Only who stayed. And that was enough. The garden came back to life quietly. Not all at once. Not with ceremony. But with movement. Edward noticed it first in the early morning, when sunlight spilled through the wide glass doors and landed on grass that had gone untouched for years. The dew shimmered like it had been waiting. He stood there with a mug of coffee cooling in his hands and listened, not to silence but to sound. A creak. He frowned slightly and stepped closer to the window. The swing set was moving. Slow at first. A gentle forward and back rhythm, like someone testing whether it was still allowed to exist. Then came laughter. Not loud, not sharp, but unmistakably alive. Edward's chest tightened as he pushed the door open and stepped barefoot onto the patio. The air smelled like cut grass and morning warmth. He hadn't realized how long it had been since the garden had smelled like anything at all. Ruth sat beneath the old oak tree, her back against the trunk. Sophia and Amelia were beside her, one seated in the adaptive swing, the other standing with Ruth's hands guiding her balance. Ruth tapped lightly on the swing's chain, keeping time. "Top! Top!" Pause. Sophia giggled and kicked her legs. Amelia tilted her head, listening, not with ears alone, but with her whole body. She reached out, fingers brushing the chain, and tapped once. Ruth smiled. "Yes," she murmured. Just like that. Edward didn't interrupt. He sat on the stone bench near the flower bed and watched. Music drifted from a small speaker nearby. Not loud, not demanding. Just a steady rhythm, low and warm, like a heartbeat reminding the space that it was safe to exist again. Sophia leaned her head back, face turned toward the sun she couldn't see. Amelia pressed her palm against Ruth's knee, feeling the vibration of the music through bone and muscle and presence. This was how they spoke now. Through rhythm, through pressure, through shared stillness and shared motion. Edward felt something loosen in his chest as he watched his daughters move with confidence. Not certainty, not mastery, but trust. They weren't waiting to be corrected. They weren't being measured. They were being met. Later that afternoon, Edward carried a box out from the storage room. It had been sealed for years. Inside were toys still wrapped in tissue paper. Soft blocks, wind chimes, a small drum his wife had picked out long before the twins were born. Edward set the box down in the grass and opened it slowly, as if expecting the past to rush out and knock him flat. It didn't. Instead, Ruth knelt beside him. "These don't have to mean anything painful," she said gently. "They can mean now." He handed her the drum. Ruth tapped it once, then again. Sophia's fingers twitched. Amelia leaned forward, her hand hovering uncertainly until Ruth guided it down to the drumhead. "Top!" The sound echoed, small, round, complete. Amelia smiled. Edward felt tears blur his vision, but he didn't wipe them away. He didn't need to. Days passed like this, not marked by charts or checklists, but by moments. Sophia learning to signal excitement by tapping twice on Edward's wrist. Amelia pressing her forehead against his chest when she needed grounding. Edward learning the subtle language of their breathing, when it quickened, when it slowed, when it asked for space, when it asked for more. He stopped timing sessions, stopped logging responses, stopped asking doctors how close they were to milestones. Instead, he asked Ruth simple questions. Did they laugh today? Yes. Did they feel safe? Yes. That was enough. The mansion no longer echoed. White walls softened with art and sound. Hallways filled with gentle narration. Ruth describing the warmth of sunlight. Edward describing the texture of leaves, the shape of the wind. The staff noticed a change too. People lingered longer in rooms. Voices lifted. Music played while meals were cooked. The house exhaled. One evening, as the sun set low and painted the sky in deep gold, Edward sat on the floor of the nursery with Sophia and Amelia curled against him. Ruth watched from the doorway, giving space without leaving. Edward hummed. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't even particularly musical, but it was his. Sophia tapped twice against his arm. Amelia followed, slower, deliberate. Edward smiled and kept humming, matching their rhythm instead of leading it. For the first time in his life, he wasn't trying to fix the moment. He was inside it. Ruth stepped closer and placed a hand on his shoulder, not to guide, not to instruct, just to be there. Edward looked up at her, gratitude too deep for words settling into his bones. The world would never see Sophia and Amelia, not the way it valued seeing. But Edward did. He saw them in laughter, in trust, in the way their bodies leaned into love without fear. And he saw Ruth, not as help, not as miracle worker, but as what she had always been, a steady center. As night fell and the house quieted, not with silence, but with peace, Edward carried his daughters to bed. The garden lights flickered on outside, illuminating the swing, still swaying gently in the breeze. Life, once awakened, didn't need permission to continue. Edward stood for a moment in the doorway of the nursery, listening to the sound of his daughters breathing, to the low hum of music still lingering in the air. He understood now. Love had never been impossible. He had simply been absent. And sometimes, he thought as he turned off the light, the one the world overlooks carries the greatest light. My brother once challenged me and said this channel would never get subscribers. If this story moved you even a little, prove him wrong by clicking subscribe right now. Don't forget to like and share this story, because stories about love, humility, and healing deserve to travel far.